Ladies and gentlemen, we're here tonight to celebrate the centennial of a statesman, a profile in courage, and an extraordinary man we are all proud to have served, the 37th President of the United States, Richard Milhouse Nixon. You know, years ago, Meg Greenfield of the Washington Post wrote that she belonged to what she called the Nixon generation. What distinguishes us as a group, she said, is that we are too young to remember a time when Richard Nixon was not on the political scene and too old reasonably to expect that we shall ever see one. Meg Greenfield was distressed about this. You know, yet her thesis rings true. We are the Nixon generation. We were born into and lived through what Bob Dole called the age of Nixon, and what a time it was, and what a man he was. Home from the war in 1946, Richard Nixon was elected to the 80th Congress and swiftly became its most famous member, for he would exhibit early on an attribute that was marked his entire life and that Tricia referenced earlier: perseverance. Because he believed a disheveled ex-communist named Whittaker Chambers, and because he distrusted an establishment icon, Alger Hiss, Congressman Nixon persevered to expose the wartime treason of Hiss. By 1948, he was an American hero, so popular the Democratic Party did not even field a candidate against him. In 1950, he captured the Senate seat with the largest majority in the history of the state of California. Yet the same people who loved Harry Truman's Give 'em Hell campaign, whined that Mr. Nixon played too rough. In the Taft-Eisenhower battle of 1952, an internationalist, the boss was the vice presidential nominee and a man of destiny. Then it was that the establishment first moved to bring him down. They hyped a phony story about a political fund, alleged it was for Senator Nixon's personal benefit, and instigated a great hue and cry for General Eisenhower to drop him from the ticket. Senator Nixon's decision to defend his record and integrity in the Checkers speech, though mocked by his enemies, remains the most brilliant use of television by a political figure in the 20th century. In the 1950s, he redefined the vice presidency as a force in foreign policy, braved a lynch mob in Caracas, became the first vice president to travel behind the Iron Curtain, and confronted Khrushchev's bluster in the kitchen debate. By 1960, he had no serious challenger for the nomination. And after the closest election in history, about which there hung the aroma of vote fraud in Texas and Illinois,
Missouri.
Missouri? I was out in Missouri. He went home to California to run for governor. After a brutal primary, he was gaining on Governor Brown when the Cuban Missile Crisis broke his momentum, and the boss went down to his second defeat and looked to be out for the count. Believing he had nothing to lose, he came down from his suite the following morning to deliver to the press words that will live in infamy. As Cactus Jack Garner said, he gave it to him with the bark on. Mr. Nixon was now thought to be finished. ABC put together an instant documentary entitled The Political Obituary of Richard M. Nixon. And the featured interview was with that astute political analyst, Alger Hiss. I think Alger went on to be an MSNBC commentator, did he not? Drop that from the C-SPAN rendition. But as Mark Twain said, the reports of his death were premature. Moving his family to New York to practice law Richard Nixon entered what he would call his wilderness years. But after the Goldwater-Rockefeller bloodbath in 1964, with our party bitterly divided, the boss volunteered to introduce the nominee at the Cow Palace and did so in one of the finest addresses he ever delivered. But after he brought that contentious convention together, with his introduction, Senator Goldwater, my hero then, proceeded to tear it apart, declaring extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. Now, Dwight Chapin, who introduced me, was in the limousine that carried the boss away from the Cow Palace. Dwight has told me what the boss said in that car about Senator Goldwater's speech. But there's no need, Dwight, to repeat those discouraging words. Almost all of the other big-name Republicans abandoned Senator Goldwater, but the old man stood by him. He traveled the nation working longer and harder for Goldwater and the party than did the senator himself. After the crushing defeat that fall, the Republican Party was reduced to one half of the Democratic Party's strength. 140 House seats, 32 Senate seats, only 17 governors. The Republican Party was a house divided and a house in ruins. It was an open question whether it would survive. And now began the greatest comeback in American political history. When I arrived in New York to join the boss in January of 1966, his staff consisted of 3 people. I occupied one desk in the office outside his own. A second occupant of that office was Rose Woods, and a third a Miss Ryan. More exactly, Patricia Ryan Nixon, the future First Lady of the United States, from whom I used to bum cigarettes regularly. The altarpiece of that year was Richard Nixon's 6 weeks war against what LBJ called my Congress. Alone to the National Republicans, the boss campaigned across the entire country for the party in 35 states and 80 congressional districts. In November, his bold prediction of a 40-seat Republican gain in the House proved conservative. We won 47. Then, after a year off, traveling the world, came that great campaign of 1968, the most divisive year in American history since the Civil War. Many of us recall that year. Consider what happened. As we took off on January 31st with the boss going up to New Hampshire, the last day of January, the siege of Khe Sanh was at its height, and the Tet Offensive had just begun. 4 weeks later, Governor Romney quit the race. Senator Eugene McCarthy then stunned the nation, capturing 42% of the vote against President Lyndon Johnson. Robert Kennedy suddenly leapt into the race. On March 31st, the boss asked me to monitor President Johnson's speech on Vietnam on a car radio at LaGuardia Airport to brief him when he arrived back from visiting Julie at Smith. At the end of that speech, President Johnson suddenly announced that he would not run again. 4 days after that political earthquake, Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis. Washington and 100 other cities exploded in riots that lasted days and required tens of thousands of troops. In early June, a week after our Oregon primary victory, I got a 3 a.m. call from our Bible building headquarters. Robert Kennedy had been shot in Los Angeles in a hotel kitchen. I called the boss. Julie and David had been watching TV and already awakened him. That August, the Democratic Party came apart in a bloody brawl in the streets between police and protesters in Chicago. And so it went in that dramatic and divisive year. But at its end, Richard Nixon was President of the United States. Now consider the city he came to and the hostility he found here. The nation had been torn apart by a half-decade of assassinations and riots, crime and campus anarchy. 30,000 Americans were dead in Vietnam. 500,000 soldiers were tied down in an endless war. The country was coming apart. Richard Nixon was the first president since Zachary Taylor to take the oath of office with both houses of Congress against him. The bureaucracy was deep-dyed Democratic liberal. The press corps was 90% hostile. The Warren Court was at the peak of its power. And the best and the brightest who had led us into Vietnam were deserting to join their children in protests against what they suddenly discovered was, quote, Nixon's war. As the presidential limousine came up Pennsylvania Avenue after the inaugural, it was showered with debris. I remember it well. As Shelley and I were entering the White House reviewing stand for the inaugural parade, the Secret Service asked me to step off the planks onto the muddy lawn of the White House because the President of the United States was directly behind me and was entering the reviewing stand. I did so. And as the President passed by, he looked over, and in the first words I ever heard from Richard Nixon as President of the United States, he said, "Buchanan, was that you throwing the eggs?" He always called me by my last name. But now consider what he accomplished. By the end of his first term, all U.S. troops were out of Vietnam. Our POWs were headed home. Every provincial capital was in South Vietnam's hands. He had ended the war with honor as he had promised. He had negotiated and signed the greatest arms limitation treaty since the Washington Naval Agreement of 1922, SALT I and the ABM Treaty. He had ended the implacable hostility of the People's Republic of China that had endured since Mao's revolution and the Korean War. In his second term, he would order the strategic airlift that saved Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Israel never had a better friend, said Golda Meir. And in November 1972, Richard Nixon was rewarded with the most sweeping landslide in history, 49 states and 60% of the vote, because of the campaigns he had led and he had conducted in 66 and 68 and 70 and 72. A party on its deathbed in 1964 was on its way to becoming the new majority party, America's party, which would capture the presidency and win more than 40 states in 4 of the next 5 presidential elections. That was the president's accomplishment. The president's memoirs begin, "I was born in a house my father built." Well, the Republican Party in the last third of the 20th century was the house that Nixon built. In domestic policy, he was the first environmental president, creating the Council on Environmental Quality and EPA. To battle the scourge of cancer, he established the National Cancer Institute. To close the widening chasm between the generations and professionalize our military, he ended the draft. He made 6 nominations for the Supreme Court. 4 made it. Not a bad average when you consider the Senate we were up against. As for our Southern strategy, when Richard Nixon first took the oath of office, 10% of Southern schools were desegregated. When he left, 70% were desegregated. You know, as Bob Dole said in that eulogy at Yorba Linda, eloquent eulogy, it was the age of Nixon. Well, Nixon was a dominant figure on the national scene in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. His influence lived on into the 20th century and through the 20th century and into the 21st. Let me ask you, would there be a Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library had it not been for Richard Nixon selecting this honorable and good man as vice president? Would there be a George H.W. Bush Presidential Library if Richard Nixon had not recognized the talent of this man who had just lost his second statewide race in Texas and brought him up to Washington to make him chairman of the National Party then ambassador to the UN. When Ronald Reagan, whom I served, came out of the West to launch his revolution, his first national security advisor and first domestic policy chief, Dick Allen and Marty Anderson, both came off our 68 campaign staff and White House staff. Both of Reagan's tech secretaries of state, Al Haig and George Shultz, and his Secretary of Defense, Cap Weinberger, came out of the Nixon National Security Council or the Nixon Cabinet. The man Ronald Reagan chose as Chief Justice of the United States, William Rehnquist, was elevated to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon. And Reagan's choice as Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, was the Domestic Policy Research Coordinator in New York in 1968. The maestro was a damn fine researcher, too. In 1996, when Bob Dole was the leading candidate for the Republican nomination, he was most closely being pursued by two former members of Nixon's White House staff. Lamar Alexander was one. I forget the other guy. This brings back a memory of that 1992 election after I had lost 10 straight primaries to President Bush. I called the old man in Saddle River. And when he came on the line, I said, 10 for 10, not bad, eh, sir? President Nixon paused and said, Buchanan, you're the only extremist I know with a sense of humor. Come on up and bring Shelley with you. In 2001, George W. Bush chose as Secretary of Defense the man that Richard Nixon had picked to head up LBJ's poverty program and to monitor wage and price controls, two plum assignments for a rising young Republican star, Donald Rumsfeld, before President Nixon named him ambassador to NATO. But the president did have his idiosyncrasies, and I'll just tell one story about that. For 9 years, I produced the president's briefing books, questions and answers on every conceivable subject he's going to get on a press conference. And I did that for years, and I would have about 30 questions in the book, about 100 to 200 word answers, and I called around all the departments, get the NSC and everything, called them in. So I also, after we do that, I would send the president a memo in the late afternoon of his press conference that had 12 or 10 questions. I said, these are the most likely questions I believe you're going to receive. And I would send that to him. And after one press conference, he knocked them all out of the park. And we had predicted every single question. So I waited for the call. He always called me at night after something like this. He said, well, Buchanan, you did your usual excellent job. I noticed you predicted every single question they would ask. I said, yes, sir, we did. He said, well, that's very good. But there were some other questions in the briefing book that they did not ask. Next time, leave those out. Click.
Yes, sir.
Oliver Wendell Holmes once observed, it is required of a man that he share the action and passion of his time at peril of being judged not to have lived. Richard Nixon shared the action and passion of his time. Again and again and again, he came back from woundings, he came back from defeats. After he left the White House, he would write 9 books on foreign policy and the great men he had known. And there were many. For only Franklin Roosevelt equaled Richard Nixon in having been on 5 presidential tickets. Now, as this centennial approached, the phone calls started coming into me, and I'm sure other folks, from the offspring of the old Jackal Pack, asking, what are your thoughts on Watergate? My great regret is that the old man is not here tonight, so I can tell him my thoughts on his old tormentors. In the words of Nick Carraway to the great Gatsby, they were a rotten crowd, sir. You're worth the whole damn bunch put together. Nixon now more than ever